My name is Renee Foster, I'm 35, and at my brother's MBA, my mother lifted her glass and announced that I would be covering his $110,000 tuition balance because, in her exact words, I didn't have kids to spend it on. She said it the way you'd mention an unused gift card sitting in a drawer. Around the table, relatives nodded along like this was old news they'd already accepted. My brother didn't even look surprised. He looked at me the way you look at a vending machine that's already taken your money, just waiting for the item to drop. "No," I said. The table went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet right before something breaks. My mother's smile didn't fall so much as harden into place. My father studied the tablecloth like it owed him an explanation. My brother asked, low enough that only I could hear it clearly, if I was really going to embarrass him like this in front of everyone. I thought about the rent I'd covered when he quit his first job after 6 weeks, the car payment he'd sworn was temporary, the credit card balance my mother had promised, on his behalf, that he'd repay. He never had. Sitting there, I didn't feel like a sister anymore. I felt like a reserve account the family had finally decided to drain to zero. When I stood up to leave, my brother looked at me like I'd stolen something that already belonged to him. For 2 weeks after that dinner, my family didn't speak to me at all. Then an unknown number called my phone. A professor from my brother's business school introduced himself and said he wasn't calling about tuition. He was calling because my brother had just won a venture fellowship for his capstone business plan, and the original file listed me as the author. My hand actually started shaking. Before I could get a full sentence out, my mother texted, "Pick up the phone." My brother called once, then twice, then 7 times in a row without leaving a single voicemail. By midnight, I understood the name in that file wasn't a clerical mistake. What I didn't understand yet was how many people at that celebration already knew exactly where his plan had come from, or what they were about to ask me to do once the school started asking questions. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we tell on Misty Reads, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now because what that professor found is only the beginning of what this family tried to bury. My brother's name was Caleb, and by 28 he'd turned other people's patients into a permanent safety net. My mother, Sandra, called him a late bloomer. My father, Walter, preferred the word entrepreneurial. I just called him my brother because for years that word alone had been enough to make me stop noticing the pattern underneath it. When Caleb quit a sales job after 6 weeks, I quietly covered 2 months of his rent. When his car was days from repossession, I paid the balance after he promised to pay me back from his next commission. He sent me $200, then bought himself a new phone. Later, $3,000 meant for a certification course turned into a weekend trip with his girlfriend, Meg. Every rescue came wrapped in the same explanation. Caleb was still finding himself. I was already established, so surely I could afford to wait. That explanation was exactly why the MBA announcement bothered me before my mother ever mentioned tuition. Caleb hadn't told me he was applying, hadn't asked for a single piece of advice, even though I ran an operations consultancy and had spent over a decade building financial models for a living. And yet somehow everyone else at that table already knew he'd been admitted to Ashford School of Business and selected for a conditional venture fellowship. My mother called that fellowship proof he'd already paid his own way, conveniently ignoring that it only covered $30,000 and depended entirely on his project staying eligible. The rest, tuition and required residency costs, landed somewhere north of $100,000. Their solution to that gap, apparently, was me. The morning after I said no, Caleb sent one private message. "You made me look like a beggar in front of Meg. Not that I'd hurt him, notice, but that I'd damaged the image he'd spent months constructing." An hour later, he tagged me in a glossy post announcing his admission, thanking the family members who understood that belief requires sacrifice, standing beside a photo of himself holding an Ashford folder like a diploma. Because my name was attached, people congratulated both of us. Anyone scrolling past would have assumed I was proud to bankroll him. I untagged myself without commenting. My mother called that evening, and she didn't open with hello. "You have the money," she said. Having money and owing it to Caleb are 2 very different things, I told her. "You don't have kids, Renee," she said. "What exactly are you saving it for?" That question landed harder than I expected it to. I'd spent years being careful because nobody had ever been there to catch me when I fell. I funded my own retirement, paid for my own health insurance out of pocket, carried 2 employees through a brutal slow season, and kept 6 months of payroll sitting untouched because people actually depended on me. In my family, though, being responsible never made my needs more legitimate. It just made them easier to erase. 2 days later, an automated email from Ashford landed in my business inbox. Caleb had listed me as a potential family sponsor on a financial planning form. It didn't legally obligate me to anything, but it proved that celebration dinner had been staged around a decision that was made long before I ever walked into the room. I called the finance office myself, had my name pulled off the form, and requested written confirmation that no account, guarantee, or sponsorship could ever be created under my name without my signature. I forwarded that confirmation to my parents and to Caleb. Nobody replied. Instead, my father cancelled our standing Sunday call. My aunt informed me that my success meant nothing if I couldn't lift up the next person, and Meg left a voicemail warning that my refusal might push Caleb somewhere very dark. They were quietly assigning me responsibility for whatever he decided to do next. For the first time, I really noticed how often I'd been cast as the reasonable one, expected to absorb rude comments because Caleb was insecure, expected to cover expenses because my parents were tired, expected to forgive broken promises because holding him accountable would just create conflict nobody wanted to deal with. A week later, Caleb emailed me with the subject line "Last Chance." No apology, no proposed budget, just the tuition payment schedule with the first due date highlighted in yellow. Underneath it, he'd written, "If I lose this, everyone will know exactly why." I didn't respond. 3 days after that, the professor called, and suddenly tuition wasn't the ugliest thing my family thought they could take from me. His name was Dr. Simon Reyes, director of Ashford's Venture Lab. He was calling with authorization from the Academic Integrity Office because Caleb's capstone project contained intellectual property and operational data tied directly to my company. The committee was preserving evidence and verifying authorship before formally interviewing him. I closed my office door. My fingers went numb around the phone. Caleb's submission was called Mid-Shift Care, a network of evening childcare centres for parents whose shifts ran past when ordinary daycare closed its doors. It included site selection criteria, staffing ratios, licensing assumptions, customer interviews, and a full 5-year financial model. Caleb had presented it as 10 months of independent research. The faculty panel had ranked it first in his entire cohort and used it to award his fellowship. For a few seconds, I genuinely couldn't speak. I locked my office door and sat down because my knees didn't feel especially reliable right then. 4 years earlier, I'd built something called Overnight Bridge for an urgent care client who couldn't retain staff with young kids at home. I'd interviewed shift workers, mapped licensing requirements across 3 states, built out staffing schedules, and designed a model for converting vacant retail space into secure overnight childcare. I worked after client hours most nights, sometimes until 2 in the morning. When an investor pulled out at the last minute, I shelved the whole concept. I never published it. I certainly never gave it to Caleb. 8 months earlier, Caleb had borrowed my old laptop after his crashed in the middle of his application cycle. I'd set up a temporary login and left the laptop at our parents' house for him to grab. When he returned it, he joked that I'd saved his future. I only remembered that exchange when Dr. Reyes told me the original document had come off my laptop. We initially thought it was a template issue, he explained. Then we opened the document properties. Author field, Renee Foster. Company field, my firm's name. Creation date, 4 full years before Caleb's supposed research even began. Hidden comments still referenced Overnight Bridge by name, and the spreadsheet carried the exact same revision history underneath. Caleb had changed the title, the colour scheme, and the executive summary. He hadn't touched the file's actual lineage. Dr. Reyes asked whether Caleb had worked for my firm, contributed to the original research, received permission, or collaborated with me directly. I answered no every single time. During faculty review, an accounting professor had noticed mid-shift care used outdated labour assumptions, and a hidden source link traced back to an archived page on my own company's domain, which is what triggered the full metadata review in the first place. Because Caleb had certified in writing that all research and writing were entirely his own, this now threatened his fellowship, his final grade, and his entire place in the programme. My first reaction wasn't satisfaction, it was humiliation. Strangers had read work I still considered unfinished, and genuinely believed my brother had built it from nothing. He'd stood in front of professors, accepted praise, and constructed a professional identity out of nights I'd spent completely alone at a kitchen table. Stay with me here, because the middle of this story is the part that actually broke my family apart, and I think you'll want to subscribe to Misty Reads before we get there. I asked Dr. Reyes to protect any data tied to former clients. He agreed to preserve everything inside the school's review system, and I promised to provide only what established authorship, nothing more. He advised me not to contact Caleb before the school issued a formal notice. The second we hung up, Caleb called. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Then my mother's message appeared in all caps. Pick up the phone. Caleb called 4 more times inside 11 minutes. Still no voicemail. That silence told me everything. He wasn't calling to ask what the professor had found. He already knew exactly what the professor had found. My archive showed a copy of Overnight Bridge exported that same weekend Caleb had borrowed the laptop. The device matched his temporary login perfectly. I opened the original file and stared at my own name sitting in the Properties panel. Next to the plan was a note I'd left myself after the investor backed out. Do not confuse delay with failure. I'd genuinely forgotten writing that sentence. Caleb hadn't. In Midshift Care's public fellowship summary, he'd used it, word for word, as his closing line. The shaking finally stopped. I saved the access record and called my firm's technology attorney because I wanted to make sure nobody could quietly rewrite the coming week as just another family misunderstanding. She told me to preserve everything and never argue by phone. Facts lose their shape inside families, she said. So I focused on 3 questions. Who actually created the plan? Who authorised Caleb to take it? And whether he'd knowingly altered it to claim academic credit. The version history began with my own research notes 4 years earlier and ran through 81 dated revisions, showing me build the model, write the risk analysis, and refine the staffing formulas Caleb later presented as his own thinking. A copy had been exported through his temporary account. Months later, that exact branch resurfaced as Midshift Care, my company name stripped clean out of it. The second answer hurt worse. Caleb had emailed months earlier saying his entrepreneurship module required a venture concept and asked me to hand him something strong enough to impress the panel. I offered to review his outline and teach him how to build a proper model. I refused to choose his idea for him, write his plan, or let him submit client work as his own. He never responded to that email. 2 days after my refusal, my mother forwarded Caleb a PDF of Overnight Bridge, the exact file I'd once sent my parents while I was still considering the original investment. Her message read, "Use this. Renee abandoned it, and she has plenty of other ideas anyway. Change the name so she doesn't get territorial." Caleb wrote back, "What if she recognises the numbers?" My father entered the thread 11 minutes later. "She won't see the final project unless somebody creates a problem." I read those 3 messages over and over until the screen finally dimmed on its own. My mother remembered exactly how hard I'd worked, remembered sitting with me the night the investor pulled out. And still, my disappointment hadn't made the work mine to her. It had made it available. I remembered the Saturday I'd offered to help Caleb properly, cleared my whole calendar, prepared a blank forecasting template, even bought the coffee he liked. He never showed up. My mother later said he felt judged by the idea of being taught by his own sister. Now I finally understood. He hadn't rejected my help. He'd rejected the part where help required actual effort, and my mother had shielded him from that discomfort by simply handing him the finished answer instead. The third answer came from a freelancer's instruction sheet Caleb had used. "Keep the unit economics exactly as they are," he'd written. Say I personally interviewed 380 local parents.
We don't have time for real interviews, so just build percentages that support the demand numbers. He'd also asked for my company's name to be scrubbed entirely, and the file's origin made untraceable. He hadn't just hidden the source, he'd fabricated data to sell it. I sent all 3 items to Dr. Reyes, along with a formal statement confirming I'd authorized no academic use whatsoever. I left out the family insults, the tuition messages, the years of unpaid debts. The truth on its own was strong enough without decoration. Before I hit submit, I sat staring at that authorization box for almost 10 full minutes. One click could genuinely change Caleb's life, but the change had actually started the moment he uploaded that plan under his own name, not the moment I documented it. I signed and sent the record. That evening, the school notified Caleb of a formal authorship review and froze his fellowship funds. He called me from 4 different numbers. My mother sent pick up the phone 6 separate times. My father wrote, "We need to agree on a family version before outsiders decide what happened." I answered once, by email. "I will not discuss evidence over the phone. Preserve every file and message you have. I will attend any formal meeting Ashford schedules." My mother replied within the minute, "A formal meeting? This is your brother, not a criminal case. If I cooperated, Caleb could lose the entire program and my parents might never speak to me again. If I stayed quiet, the school would reward a lie, and every honest student in that cohort would quietly pay for it. I wanted peace, badly. I just no longer believed silence would actually buy me any. Ashford scheduled a formal authorship conference for the following Tuesday. Caleb called the plan a family-developed concept and brought both our parents as witnesses. Meg came as his support person. My Aunt Ruth asked to attend after hearing I was allegedly using the school to punish Caleb over a tuition disagreement. The integrity officer admitted everyone only after they signed a confidentiality acknowledgement. The night before, I wrote 2 sentences on an index card. Answer only what you actually know. Do not rescue anyone from their own silence. I kept it folded in my coat pocket the entire drive there. Caleb's greatest advantage had never really been evidence. It was our family's lifelong instinct to fill every uncomfortable silence with an excuse on his behalf. Before the meeting started, my mother left me a whispered voicemail. "You don't have to lie," she said. "Just don't be so exact." Caleb himself offered to name me an advisor and bring me into mid-shift care once investors came aboard, a minor supporting role in the very business he'd stolen from me outright. I almost called him back just to scream. Instead, I replayed my mother's email in my head and remembered exactly why I'd said no in the first place. I wanted Caleb to stand behind his own work. By stealing mine instead, he'd turned that one boundary into evidence against himself. Tuesday morning, I walked into Ashford carrying a single thin folder. Caleb arrived flanked by both parents, his girlfriend, and my aunt. He actually smiled when he saw I hadn't brought a laptop, mistaking the absence of theatrics for the absence of proof. The conference room had no stage, no audience, no screen waiting for a dramatic reveal. Dr. Reyes sat beside Dr. Alana Voss, Ashford's academic integrity officer, who explained this was a fact-finding interview, not a final hearing, and warned that altering any records after formal notice would become its own separate violation. My mother held Caleb's hand. Meg sat close against his shoulder. My aunt chose the seat beside me without quite looking my way. Then Dr. Reyes opened the original file and asked the exact question my family had spent an entire week avoiding. "Mr. Foster, why does the earliest version of your capstone project list Renee Foster as the author?" Caleb claimed my laptop had basically been a shared family computer, so my name must have populated automatically. Asked why the file existed 4 full years before he'd ever borrowed it, he said we'd discussed the concept together for years and that I'd built an early shell of it. "Describe that conversation," Dr. Reyes said. Caleb glanced sideways at my mother. "We used to talk about working parents needing overnight childcare," he said. "What exactly did you contribute to the model?" Dr. Reyes asked. Caleb shifted in his seat. "The vision," he said. Dr. Reyes asked why the staffing formula used a blended ratio when state licensing rules varied heavily by age group. Caleb cited generic industry standards, but couldn't name a single age bracket. Asked why viable sites were limited to former pharmacies of a specific size, he said they were simply affordable. Asked what made smaller storefronts more expensive to convert, he stared straight at the table. I knew the answer instantly. Those particular pharmacies already had consultation rooms, existing ventilation, plumbing, and parking that dramatically cut renovation costs. I'd personally measured 14 sites myself, years earlier. Caleb had swapped out a logo without ever learning why the underlying numbers existed at all. Dr. Reyes turned to me. "Miss Foster, can you answer that?" I walked through the staffing model, the renovation assumptions, and the exact retention problem that had inspired the original research in the first place. This wasn't about proving I was smarter than my brother. It was proof the work had a real history, and I was the only one in that room who'd actually lived it. Dr. Reyes asked Caleb to identify the single assumption he'd personally changed after his supposed interviews. He mumbled something vague about pricing tiers, but the plan used the exact tuition bands from my original model, down to a discounted overnight rate I'd specifically built for hospital shift workers. He couldn't explain why that discount even existed. I could. The client's highest turnover had come from rotating night shifts, and that discount had been designed jointly with their benefits department years before Caleb ever touched a spreadsheet. Caleb cut in suddenly. "Of course she can explain it," he said. "I consulted her. Dr. Voss asked for any proof of that consultation." Caleb opened his laptop and a notification flashed across her screen. "Stop," she said sharply. Caleb froze mid-motion. The preserved project folder had registered an attempted deletion originating from his account seconds earlier. He blamed a broken link. Dr. Voss reminded him calmly of her earlier warning. Dr. Reyes no longer sounded curious. He sounded disappointed. "You didn't open a consultation note just now," he said. "You tried to delete the source archive in front of us." My mother leaned forward. "He's nervous," she said. "You're treating him like he's dangerous." Dr. Reyes looked at her evenly. "I'm treating him like a graduate student responsible for his own actions." My parents had spent years explaining Caleb through stress, potential, and bad timing. The professor asked only what he had actually done. I slid Dr. Voss the full version history. She read the sequence out loud, creation and 81 revisions under my account, an export through Caleb's temporary login, a renaming, a full removal of my company details, and finally a formal submission. Caleb insisted the export itself proved permission. The access log showed otherwise, a temporary login, no transfer message, no invitation, no license of any kind. Dr. Reyes asked directly why Caleb had never cited me. "Because it was family work," Caleb said. "Families don't invoice each other for ideas." Dr. Voss then read my original offer to teach him, my explicit refusal to let him submit client work, and my mother's response underneath it. "Use this." Renee abandoned it. "Change the name so she doesn't get territorial." My father's reply followed. "She won't see the final project unless somebody creates a problem." Hearing those words read aloud was somehow worse than finding them alone at my kitchen table. My mother hadn't misunderstood my boundary. She'd planned directly around it. My father hadn't been passively unaware. He'd been counting on my absence the entire time. I pressed the folded card in my coat pocket and let their silence stay exactly where it belonged, with them. My Aunt Ruth finally turned toward my parents. "You told us Caleb earned this project entirely himself," she said. "My father called it a misunderstanding." "No," Ruth said. "You wanted us to help pressure Renee." She shifted her chair fully toward mine, the first relative all afternoon to physically move in my direction instead of away from it. Meg asked whether Caleb had claimed the childcare interviews as genuinely his own. He cited them as additional market validation, but said the platform had lost all 380 original responses. My final document was that freelancer's instruction sheet. Dr. Voss read Caleb's request to fabricate percentages while preserving my exact economics word for word. Meg had personally helped him rehearse this same presentation. Now she asked quietly, "Was any part of that story actually true?" Caleb didn't answer her. He looked at me instead. "You couldn't stand that I finally had something," he said. "You already have a company, money, this whole independent life. I had one chance to finally be taken seriously, and you needed everyone to know it started with you." There it was. My work became less mine to him simply because I already had other things. His need had somehow become ownership. He was furious the plan could still be traced back to me at all. My mother asked if I'd just call the concept family property. My father urged the school not to destroy Caleb's future over one file. Dr. Reyes said integrity was never a family negotiation. Caleb had submitted another person's work, concealed its origin, fabricated research data, certified it as entirely original, and attempted to delete evidence in the middle of a formal review. Meg stood up. Caleb reached for her wrist, but she stepped back before he could touch it. "You used Renee's work to win the fellowship," she said. "Then you used my belief in you to sell it to me." She picked up her bag and left without raising her voice once. The door had barely closed behind her when Caleb's whole expression shifted. He said Meg was being dramatic, that the fellowship committee was elitist, that I'd apparently manipulated everyone because I knew how to sound professional. Then he demanded compensation for the months he'd spent, in his words, improving Overnight Bridge. Even after being fully exposed, he was still trying to bill me for the theft. Dr. Reyes asked whether replacing a name and inventing fake respondents counted as improvements in his mind. Caleb had no answer for that. He shoved his chair back into the wall, accused me of ruining his relationship, and warned that the school would regret humiliating him publicly. Dr. Voss ended the interview there, pending formal review. The fellowship stayed frozen, the project ungraded, his system access restricted, and the attempted deletion referred straight to the disciplinary panel. My mother whispered that I could still fix this. I looked at Caleb and at the 3 documents sitting between us. "I didn't come here to ruin your future," I told him. "I came because all of you tried to build it out of work you stole from mine. Nobody followed me out when I left." For once, they were all too busy facing the person they'd spent years protecting. In the elevator, I finally let go of that index card. Its edges had cut small red lines into my palm without me even noticing. I didn't feel victorious. I felt the strange relief of leaving a room without having to carry anyone else's version of what had just happened. The final decision came 19 days later. Ashford found Caleb responsible for plagiarism, data fabrication, scholarship misrepresentation, and interference with an active review. His fellowship was formally rescinded. The project failed outright, and he was dismissed from the MBA program entirely. He could only seek readmission after 3 years, and any future application would require full disclosure. There was no secret blacklist anywhere, just a documented decision he could never honestly leave out. Her. Because Caleb had tied his entire identity to that credential, the consequences spread outward fast. His graduate housing ended immediately. A consulting firm quietly withdrew an internship offer that required good academic standing, and his Ashford MBA candidacy vanished from his profile within days. Meg ended things with him and posted one vague line about ambition without honesty just being performance. She never once named him publicly. My parents lost a non-refundable housing deposit and had to repay fellowship funds already dispersed. My mother blamed the school, the professor, the freelancer, and me. Everyone except the person who'd actually signed the originality statement. For weeks she called relatives before I could reach them myself, describing Caleb as a gifted student crushed by a mere technicality. But the official findings were specific, and her version kept weakening every time someone asked why a technicality happened to involve invented interviews and an attempted deletion. The social fallout never came from me publishing anything. It came entirely from my parents making claims the actual facts simply couldn't support. My Aunt Ruth apologised, admitting it had been easier to assume I was selfish than to imagine an entire celebration dinner had been staged as leverage against me. A couple of cousins went quiet once they finally saw the message screenshots for themselves. Others insisted I should have handled academic fraud privately, purely because the offender happened to share my last name. Caleb called daily for a while, then emailed once I finally blocked his number. He offered to admit a simple citation error if I'd just declare Overnight Bridge a joint family project. He wanted to trade fabricated data and outright theft for a formatting mistake. His last call came from my father's phone. I answered only because my father had recently had a concerning medical test, and I assumed it might be about his results. Caleb spoke before I could even say hello. "Please," he said, and the confidence from that conference room was completely gone from his voice. "Tell them you gave me the plan. You don't have to say when exactly. If you confirm permission, they might reduce it to a citation violation. I'll pay you back. I'll work for you for free. I'll sign anything you want. I asked whether he'd also be telling the school those 380 interviews never actually happened. He went quiet, then said that part could be explained separately. Even at his absolute lowest point, he wasn't asking how to finally tell the truth. He was asking which specific lie I'd be willing to carry for him instead. Part of me wanted to offer him one condition: admit everything without any negotiation, apologise to the students he'd beaten out for that fellowship, and start over somewhere honest. But that would have just turned accountability into one more plan I'd designed for him. If he was ever going to actually change, that first step had to be entirely his own. My mother took the phone from him and said families survive by protecting one another. She reminded me Caleb had already lost Meg, his apartment, the internship, and 3 years off his career timeline. "Hasn't he paid enough?" she asked. I told her consequences were never a bill I got to control. Then I said I wouldn't submit a false statement, wouldn't fund an appeal, and would only discuss any of it in writing from that point forward. I hung up and blocked my father's number too, until he eventually emailed me directly about his own test results. The silence that followed didn't feel triumphant. I grieved the parents I'd once thought I had, and the brother I kept quietly hoping would finally become accountable on his own. But grief, at least, was cleaner than the constant confusion had been. The school's decision made the facts impossible to edit after the fact. Caleb appealed, calling Overnight Bridge abandoned family property and the deletion accidental. The panel upheld every single finding without exception. He moved back home and took a temporary customer service job at an insurance call centre. My mother called it a transition period, right up until she started criticising him for not trying hard enough. Meanwhile, I reopened my original Overnight Bridge folder, not because Caleb had made the idea suddenly valuable, but because defending it in that room reminded me exactly why I'd built it in the first place. I reached back out to the urgent care executive who'd originally inspired the research and learned that overnight staffing shortages had only gotten worse since then. She connected me with a hospital network actively searching for real evening childcare partnerships. For the first time in 4 years, the plan stopped being an archived disappointment. It was mine again, fully, and I finally got to decide what happened to it next. Take a second right now and subscribe to Misty Reads, because what I built with that idea afterward is honestly my favourite part of this whole story. I hired an independent research team, disclosed the full history to my attorney, and rebuilt every single assumption using current data instead of anything Caleb had touched. Reclaiming the idea didn't erase what he'd done to it. It just kept his theft from becoming the final chapter of my own work. 6 months later, Overnight Bridge opened its first pilot centre inside a renovated pharmacy near 2 hospital campuses. We launched with 38 licensed spaces, evening meals, secure transportation partnerships, and hours actually built around real shift schedules instead of assumptions. I never used Caleb's fabricated survey data. My team ran brand new interviews, updated every wage assumption from scratch, and rebuilt the entire financial model on current numbers. The pilot filled nearly every space before opening day, and a second location entered planning barely a month later. At the opening, one of my employees asked if I wanted a photo taken next to the original business plan document. I said no. That plan was never sacred just because my name sat somewhere in its metadata. It mattered because real people could finally test it, challenge it, and improve it, with actual permission this time. Ownership was never about sealing an idea away forever. It was about having the right to decide how and when it got shared. Caleb was still living with our parents, working temporary shifts, and had mostly stopped calling me directly. I heard through my aunt that my mother had started criticising him for not trying hard enough. The irony didn't feel satisfying at all. It just confirmed that her protection had never really been unconditional love. It only lasted as long as someone else was willing to absorb the cost of it. Once the money, the excuses, and the constant rescues finally ran out, Caleb had to live right beside the exact expectations everyone had spent years helping him avoid. He could still rebuild, plenty of people do. Dismissal was serious, not a life sentence. He could work, repay what he owed, study honestly somewhere down the line, and reapply once he was eligible again. What I couldn't do, and would never do again, was manufacture that growth on his behalf. Saving him from every single consequence had never once moved him forward. It had only taught him to keep searching for the next person willing to stand between him and reality. My father eventually asked to meet me alone. He apologized for that email thread and admitted he'd known Caleb had copied something, though he claimed he hadn't understood exactly how much. I told him the amount was never really the point. He'd known enough to hope I would simply never see it. We didn't repair our relationship in one single conversation. I stopped pretending an apology could erase a choice, and he stopped asking me to pretend nothing had happened at all. That, strangely, became the most honest version of our relationship we'd ever had. My mother never apologized. She sent a birthday card that year saying she hoped I'd choose family again soon. I sent back no argument, just one short note. I chose not to lie. The distance since then has been your choice, not mine. Caleb sent one final email after photos from the overnight bridge opening showed up in a local business journal. "So you got everything anyway," he wrote. That single sentence confirmed he still genuinely believed success was some limited object I'd deliberately withheld from him. He never could see the difference between building something and simply taking it, or between losing an opportunity and actually being denied one. I didn't respond. I stood inside the new centre one evening and watched a nurse scoop up her sleeping daughter after a 12-hour shift. That moment belonged entirely to the years of research, the failed investment, the honest rebuild, and the people who trusted us enough to show up. It never belonged to the family story Caleb had tried to write directly over mine. For the first time, I understood that refusing him hadn't made me cold at all. It had simply ended a system where my competence got treated as communal property, and his choices got treated as everyone's shared emergency. Family was never supposed to mean giving without any conditions attached. What I actually learned is that family doesn't include the right to steal someone else's labour, identity, or future out from under them. I didn't refuse to fund my brother because I wanted to watch him fail. I refused because love was never tuition, silence was never loyalty, and forgiveness was never permission to repeat the exact same harm twice. When Caleb asked me to save his MBA, he was never really asking for a second chance. He was asking me to quietly pay for a plan he'd already stolen, then lie about who actually created it. My answer was no, both times, and I'd give the exact same answer again. If you've ever had to choose the truth over keeping the peace, even knowing it might cost you the people closest to you, tell me in the comments. And if you believe family should never come with the right to steal someone else's work, subscribe to Misty Reads so you don't miss the next one.